a man in the head and sexually assaulted 2 women, which got him arrested again. That evening, while in holding at the jail annex at Las Vegas City Hall, he killed his cellmate J.J. Nobles. Then, as he was being held there as his trial approached, McKenna and 2 other inmates took corrections officers hostage, with the plan being escape. It ended after almost 2 full days with his 2 accomplices dead. He received the death penalty for the 1979 murder of his cellmate, and just a few years later met an 18-year-old Troy Kell and reportedly took him under his wing. In October of 1988, Kell, then 20, was fired upon with buckshot following a fight in the maximum security exercise yard with a fellow inmate. Necessary, he explained in the 2002 Mark Levin HBO documentary Gladiator Days, Anatomy of a Prison Murder, to prove he would not be sexual prey. 3 years later, he received administrative discipline, and a prison employee was prosecuted for a scheme during which she smuggled bullets into the prison, some of which were later located in Troy's cell. Soon after, he was transferred to Central Utah Correctional Facility in Gunnison, Utah on a prisoner exchange, as was Lonnie Blackmon. He was a self-proclaimed maximum security risk and had come from a prison in Arkansas on his own request, about 6 months earlier, effectively sealing his own fate. By 1994, Troy was fully immersed in the white separatist movement behind bars, and on July 6th he enlisted fellow inmate Eric T. Daniels to assist him in committing murder. Daniels was a low-priority inmate who was locked up for 1 to 15 years on a forgery charge. He described years later in the Gladiator Days film how incarceration with violent and career inmates forced him to turn to violent tactics himself to survive. Daniels had already been in solitary for inciting a riot when he laid on the legs of Lonnie Blackmon so that Troy Kell could shank him more than 67 times. Daniels had filled out a fake slip that would get Lonnie transported to the prison medical clinic, along with himself and Troy Kell. The 32-year-old father of 2 was then left where Daniels was able to restrain him, and Troy was free to attack him. Another inmate had slipped Kell a makeshift key to unlock his cuffs, making him fully mobile. The brutal, sustained assault continued for several minutes, uninterrupted, while guards prepared to enter the area. The entire ordeal was filmed on prison surveillance cameras and used for the HBO documentary. Though he repeatedly cried out white power following Lonnie Blackmon's stabbing, when speaking about the role that race played in the murder, he said it was based on, quote, a power trip to begin with, but it had racial overtones to it. Officials obtained a letter Troy had sent to inmates at his old prison, announcing the upcoming murder against a minority described in derogatory terms, and coupled like facts to bolster the determination that the murder was racially motivated. Troy claimed that theirs was beef by association, and he felt that he and Lonnie Blackmon had a shared understanding that whomever got the opportunity to strike first would do just that. In a move that still raises eyebrows, Troy's former co-defendant, Sandy Shaw, was called to testify as a character witness at that trial, for the first time held right there on prison grounds due to safety concerns. Troy Michael Kell was found guilty of the aggravated murder of Lonnie Blackmon and was sentenced to death at the age of 28 on June 26, 1998. The youngest inmate in Utah to be put on death row. He shared a seemingly heartfelt apology to his victim's father and brother, and reportedly begged for his life during the penalty phase, but the prosecution set out to prove it was all a ploy by calling 2 deputies to take the stand. They each told the court that, just prior to his testimony, Troy Kell had told them he was about to act his pants off. Lonnie Blackmon's family sued the state of Utah, accusing corrections officers of doing nothing to help keep their loved one alive. Guards reportedly had a high-pressure hose, tear gas, as well as a shotgun available to them, but failed to intervene. His wife and one of his daughters later filed suit against HBO and the makers of Gladiator Days for airing Lonnie Blackmon's murder to the world. And that third alleged accomplice who supplied the piece of melted and molded plastic that Troy used to remove his handcuffs was transferred to New Mexico, where 3 years after that he was involved in a prison murder there. He was sent back to Utah. Kell has seen more than one execution stayed, the first being September 27, 1996. He had another high-profile altercation with an inmate in the aftermath of 9/11. He was implicated, along with a corrections officer, after he beat a black Muslim inmate unconscious on September 20, 2001. Jacques Miranda's eventual lawsuit stated that when he refused to participate in Muslim bashing with other inmates and guards, Troy Kell's cell was unlocked and he was allowed to be attacked. Kell's statement read that he chose not to kill Jacques Miranda, although the guard had wanted him to. Jacques Miranda sued and won compensatory damages. June 28, 2003 was Kell's last scheduled date of execution. It too was stayed pending appeal, then granted an extension past his 2010 prison wedding date. It was taking so long to execute him that the 10th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals took the issue under consideration in 2018, however threw the case out with no decision the following year, as Kell still had appeals to lesser courts available for which he hadn't yet applied. He currently has appeals pending in the Utah Supreme Court as well as at the federal level. Troy Kell is now 52 years old and is housed at Utah State Prison in Draper, Utah. He continues to await his execution by firing squad, the method by which he chose to die more than 24 years ago. Up to 2004, Utah inmates sentenced to the death penalty had the firing squad as an option, a practice which dated back more than 100 years. And had ties to the antiquated belief by early Latter-day Saints of blood atonement. Blood for blood, a life for a life. Billy Merritt, the 17-year-old accomplice who pled to lesser charges, was paroled after 12 years but found it difficult to stay out. Throughout the early 2000s, Merritt did 5 years waiting to be retried for a 2000 attempted murder and was released. He was ultimately arrested and convicted of property crimes, stalking, and drug-related offenses, and was considered a repeat offender by the time he was arrested for kidnapping and rape in 2008. Due in large part to his criminal record, he was sentenced to life without parole. William Merritt is currently 51 years old and is housed at High Desert State Prison in Susanville, California. As for Sandy Shaw, although her incarceration was fairly uneventful, her story continues to evolve. Her 1994 appeal for post-conviction relief had been filed along the lines of ineffective assistance of counsel, and the hope was that a retrial would be ordered, but before that could occur, Prosecutor Dan Seaton made a tough decision. Instead of dragging the victim's family, along with the district attorney's office, through a second murder trial which would surely dredge up comparisons to its predecessor, a plea deal was secured that saw Sandy plead guilty in exchange for a life with parole sentence. Back in 1996, 1 week after Troy Kell was sentenced to death for Lonnie Blackmon's murder, Sandy came up for parole for the first time, and several more times leading up to her December 2007 release after 21 years. When Cotton Kelly's mother heard that one of her son's killers would now be eligible for parole, she said, quote, "If you get a life sentence, then you should get life, not 10 years. But she was out, and just after, it became public that a critical witness from Sandy's 1986 preliminary hearing and 1987 trial was recanting his trial testimony. David Fletcher, the 17-year-old friend whose testimony had likely helped to convict Sandy, was changing up his story, telling Jack Sheehan of the Las Vegas Sun in 2008 that, quote, "When it all went down, I told my side of the story in court, but then the prosecutor called me out to a private room and told me if I didn't testify the way he wanted, I would go to jail. He was hell-bent to get a conviction, and I wasn't going to jail for nobody back then." He told his side of a story in a signed affidavit in March of 2008, explaining that the nickname the Show and Tell murders actually derived from his actions. I obtained a copy of the affidavit from Daniel Gleason, who was present that day and has been investigating and writing about this case since 2005. The document clarifies some of the events following Cotton Kelly's murder, stating that Fletcher was the individual who drove Sandy back to the scene the morning after. In the car with them was Stacy, who had also testified in both 1986 and 1987, adding to the allegations that Sandy bragged and was smiling when looking at Cotton's body. Stacy had also testified that during that car ride, Sandy described shooting the victim, slitting his throat, and blowing up his car. The affidavit refutes those claims, with Fletcher maintaining that while the three of them were in the car, Sandy Shaw was visibly shaken, emotional, and remorseful. It states that she never mentioned shooting Cotton Kelly herself, or robbery or murder as a motive. Sandy did, however, tell them that she did not know that Troy Kell had been concealing a firearm the night before. Fletcher, as Sandy's friend, had first-hand knowledge as to the nature of her relationship with the victim. He states here that she had come to him prior to asking Troy Kell for help, but he had turned her down. Then, after the murders took place, Fletcher states that he was on the line during a phone call between Sandy and Troy, where Troy said he would, quote, "do to her what he did to Cotton, should she decide to go to police." He goes on to assert that he knows that Sandy didn't take anyone else to the desert because they spoke in the days leading up to her arrest. It was he who shuttled other kids to the scene 5 times, he says. 2 of those visits would be the teen's downfall. One of the times he'd brought his stepbrother, who had taken jewelry from the dead man's body, which David Fletcher later pawned. On another visit, he brought along a classmate who would ultimately bring a detective back to the body. At the 1986 preliminary hearing, Fletcher says in the document that Prosecutor Dan Seaton had called a recess during his testimony and used the pawned jewelry to threaten, in front of witnesses, a grave robbing charge if he didn't corroborate Stacy's testimony. He then changed his testimony from what he now states in the affidavit to the testimony he gave at trial. He admits that he perjured himself over 20 years back because the thought of going to prison was more than he could wrap his young mind around. So he lied, he says, and believes he was, quote, responsible in large part for a great injustice, which was Sandy Shaw's murder conviction based on false evidence. My actions have been a burden to me all of these years, and it is with great relief that I now bear witness to the truth. Fletcher told Jack Sheehan in that interview that, quote, when I changed my testimony, I thought the jury would throw out what I said as unreliable, but I guess they didn't. All these years later, I feel horrible about what happened to Sandy. She was a cocky kid back then, but she didn't deserve what happened. Sandy Shaw said in the same 2008 Las Vegas Sun article that, quote, I made a horrible, immature decision to ask a friend to rough this man up so he would leave me alone. I accept that I put a man in harm's way, and I take full responsibility for the eventual loss of his life because of that. I deserve to spend some time in jail for that bad decision, but not 21 years. Troy Kell had also signed an affidavit, his attesting that there was no way Sandy could have known he'd brought a gun because she hadn't asked him to and he hadn't told her he had it. Billy Merritt did as well, along with